Well, Favour, we're back with our next episode of our mini-series on aid effectiveness and value for money. And this time we bring the focus more on the M&E side of things, and particularly the monitoring aspect of things.
One of my favorite things about the Flyway Economics podcast, the fact that we sit a lot of times with experts, people that have years of experience. And so when they speak, they're not just speaking theoretically, they're speaking from their many years of experience and lessons themselves have had to learn.
Well, we've got Daniel Ticehurst on today's show, who brings a wealth of experience, and let's get straight into listening to what he has to say.
Hello, Daniel. So lovely to have you on the Flyway Economics podcast. We're really excited about our conversation. So, can you just begin by introducing yourself to our audience?
Sure. Yeah, lovely to meet you too, and thanks for having me. A bit of kind of introduction. I put simply, I help people meet their kind of information needs and help them therefore resolve some of the decision uncertainties they face in a very complicated world. I work somewhere between evidence and governance, helping organizations make sense of the complexities they work with and in, rather than simply measure it or them. So help them tell better stories about their work, basically. Over the years, across agriculture, private sector development, finance, governance, I became kind of frustrated with how monitoring and evaluation, which should be about learning, had turned into some kind of bureaucratic kind of karaoke where we recite the words, but the song had lost its meaning. And sometimes it gets so politically constrained, it ends up almost like a role-playing exercise. These days, or the last few years, I've focused on what I call thoughtful monitoring, kind of restoring the thinking to monitoring and linking it to value, not just volume. My aim is to help these systems grow and stay alive, to learn, to adapt, to remain accountable in ways that matter to the people they serve, not just report to the people who fund the programs.
Thanks, Daniel. All right, I hope I'm not over reading into this, but your work suggests a sort of a deep dissatisfaction with traditional M&E. Would you say that was fair? A deep dissatisfaction?
No, not so much. I mean, the thing is, I don't think there is, in a way, I've thought about the question. For me, there is no such thing as traditional monitoring and evaluation. Let me mean what I explain. So I hear lots of people talk about how monitoring was just counting activities and outputs. And that's traditional M&E. And then along came results-based monitoring, which was creeping further up the hierarchy in terms of what people call results, outcomes, impacts, and so on. And I think if I look back 30 years ago, different organizations were doing the same thing, or one or the other. So I don't think it's correct necessarily to say traditional, but that's not the same as saying I haven't been frustrated. The frustration is more born through my own experience and learning from other organizations who actually did both, and they continue to do both. So in other words, both over time and at the same time between sectors, they were doing either just an accounting exercise or being overly ambitious. So when I was in Malawi in the 1980s, my M&E role was in measuring crop yields and farmer incomes and so on. And so I would say that actually they were hopelessly overly ambitious. So I think it's horses for courses in a way. So I don't like the kind of phrase, unlike traditional ... we do this, because I think everyone has so many different experiences, basically. But the frustration has been about the measuring rather than the learning and helping adaptation. So yeah.
So in some of your written work, you describe monitoring as the awkward cousin to evaluation, which is a lovely expression. What you mentioned about thoughtful monitoring a little bit earlier in your introduction about yourself, but what is thoughtful monitoring, and what's the single biggest failure of I guess I don't want to say traditional systems now because you've already said that, it's maybe not, but what's the single biggest failure of systems that thoughtful monitoring is specifically designed to solve?
I think I think on the first one of the awkward cousin, sometimes monitoring isn't always invited to the evaluation gathering, and it's kind of nobody really wants to talk to it. It's underfunded, underloved, misunderstood, and many evaluators I know almost have a disdain for it. It's so boring and mundane, and it's always going to be that way. Why bother about trying to improve it? But I think on the thoughtful monitoring, for me, it's an act of recovery. It's a kind of, it's about noticing what's changing, not just recording what's been planned. And it's about curiosity and reflection. And we'll talk about it later in terms of communities and cultures. It's about humility in the face of the uncertainty we all face. I think, in the civil service especially, they spend so much time, as you know, planning and appraising and business cases and strategic and commercial and management, and they spend so much time and money almost that they've got it right, and all you need to do is just to implement it blind. And I think monitoring gets caught up in that just blind measuring. And so I think thoughtful monitoring for me is around, I learned a lot from W. Edwards Deming, who for me is like the oracle of thoughtful management, and how he always said that the most important figures for management are the unknowable. It's trying to explore and find out things rather than just restrict yourselves to things that are taken as a good thing. And he debunked management by objectives, which is the precursor to results-based management, and coined it quite beautifully by saying management by results is like driving a car through a rear view mirror. So you get the results, but that just tells you what's happened. It doesn't tell you what to do, and so on. So thoughtful monitoring is about that, really. It's about the reflection, the learning, and a good dose of humility as well.
So Daniel, maybe speak a bit about when we first met, which was out in Abuja in Nigeria, and you were helping us review a portfolio of embedded advisors that were managed by principals in the Nigerian government who were helping them deliver the reform agenda. Did that piece of work, because we kind of asked you to do something that was very challenging for I almost said traditional monitoring and evaluation, but I don't want to fall into that trap. But for some in monitoring and evaluation, that would feel like a very intimidating assignment, because you're trying to trace things that are not being directly managed by the program. There's an input that's been provided, which is the individual, it's the advisor, and then they're left to carry out and implement something which has been decided by a third party. In this case, it was the Nigerian government, right? And so trying to understand the impact that's going on there. So to what degree, do you want to talk a little bit about that assignment, and also about how the thoughtful monitoring might have come into some of that you were doing?
Yeah, no, of course. I think that when I was working with Sabrina Nonwe, who was my colleague, I was working with her, we discovered this technique called anecdote circles, which was about how in the private sector, the one thing that stifles innovation and adaptation was the silence of the people who actually deliver the work at the sharp end. In this context, with the policy development facility, it was those advisors, about 60 of them at any one time, and they were literally cast adrift on the request of the minister to come and basically support a reform. And those ministers were called champions of change. And they were working almost in isolation of each other, scattered across federal level ministries and vice president's office and the president's office itself. And most of them had never met before. So when we introduced this technique, which was about pulling them together twice a year in circles, we read their reports to try and find out what was bothering them, what was going on, and so on, especially in the early days of establishing themselves, not forgetting it wasn't the civil servants who called for them, it was their minister. So there's a political piece going on as well in terms of their legitimacy. And we brought them together and based them around themes, and to give them a voice, not waiting for management to tell them what to do, but by meeting each other and literally sharing their experiences. It wasn't a judgmental thing. And that, apart from anything else, was the first two sessions were almost like a therapy, because they were really struggling to get on, and some were really good, some were really struggling. There were some who came from the States who didn't know how to work in a ministry at all. They had no experience, or technically they were brilliant. And so they actually worked by helping themselves. And that struck chords with thoughtful monitoring, because it is about participatory approaches also involving and giving voice to the people who deliver the support, not just end clients or beneficiaries of programs, if I can get away with using that term nowadays. But the issue was really about helping themselves reveal solutions and ways to innovate and learning from each other. And it worked really, really well. And as the program matured, we then started talking about results in terms of how they came about, not just what they were, and the dependencies in that, because they're working in systems. So it's about management listening to the frontline workers, because senior management don't often know really what's going on in terms of those environments and how change happens and how it doesn't happen.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I think, keeping with that tone, we've talked about the fact that thoughtful monitoring involves a lot of learning and adapting, and it shouldn't just be left to the M&E team. Management must be actively involved. So let's say I'm a program manager. What will my day-to-day role look like when I fully embrace thoughtful monitoring? This is different from somebody that is seeing it as purely an administrative task.
I think a manager who's embraced thoughtful monitoring starts their week kind of not with reports, but with reflection. They ask their teams, what's shifting? What are we hearing that surprises us or disappoints us? And what assumptions are being tested here? So they treat data as a conversation starter, not a verdict. By contrast, a manager spends the week chasing numbers to satisfy a reporting cycle that no one really learns from. I think it all boils down to the writings of a guy called Rondinelli back in the 80s, who was a brilliant voice on adaptive management and from an earlier era, once described development and the work of a manager as a process of trial and error and learning. And that's really where the thoughtful monitoring kicks in. But so many of the way development aids and other in the private sector sometimes have become quite allergic to error. We push the very thing we need in order to learn. And a thoughtful manager and the management and the monitoring of that sees error as information. They're not firefighting. They're trying to make sense of things, basically. So I'd say that. And I'd also say that sometimes if you've got a good manager and a good management team who are working and behaving like that, why do you need an M&E specialist on the team? Why do you need an M&E advisor? I've always believed that I'm not talking about evaluation now. I'm talking about day to day, week to week, month to month. Why do you need those other skills if you've got a good manager? But sometimes in development aid, the management team is simply there to control things and to report on things. A safe pair of hands, if you like. I'm not saying there's not a need to look after things and control things, but you can't control everything. And what you can't control are these fundamental uncertainties of not the environment of the team, but the environment in which the team is providing that support. So in the case of the PDF, the Policy Development Facility, and those embedded advisors, you can control them to a certain extent, what they do. But from a supply and demand, from the demand side, i.e. from the ministries, and from the political, the minister, and the administrative, the civil servants. The extent to which those advisors are triggering or stimulating a change of any sort is impossible to predict. You just don't know what's going to happen. And that's where the learning and the uncertainty and the ignorance comes in. So I think a manager needs to see that, and I don't necessarily think it's not an issue of methodology in terms of how M&E has been dominated so much. It's more about the culture. So in thoughtful monitoring, one of the first questions is, do you need a separate specialist? If you do, you might not have the right manager.
Daniel, there could be some risk, though. I mean, like, if I think about the whole, gender and inclusion side of things, right?
Yeah.
So there's this debate, should it be mainstreamed? And if it's mainstreamed, does it just disappear and evaporate? Or should you have this specialist who's sort of focused on it? And could we draw a parallel there with monitoring and evaluation, where we say, yes, absolutely, it should be the management driving this, which is great when the management are actually doing that and they're actually asking for information, they're actually getting the right kind of information that they need for evidence-based decisions. But if they're not, it just means that you have nothing on the program as well, and it just disappears.
No, I think it's always intrigued me what the job as a manager is. When you look at the job description, so it's those are the foundational elements I was talking about, and if the kind of manager or management team you need and the skills and capacities should reflect the environment in which they're operating in. So if you're building a road or something, you know what kind of management you need. It's a Sigma type control and so on. Whereas in many development programs, you need a different type of system and a different type of person, if you like, a team. But I think you're right. If you've got the wrong manager or the wrong management team, then you might need an M&E person to prop them up. Definitely. Ideally, you want to mainstream, but if you've got the wrong person, it is going to disappear. But ultimately, it's what the funders are wanting to pay for, the type of team. So I work with a development consultancy company whose managers were more, I would say, administrators. They looked after the assets. They did a risk register, which was every risk you can think of, apart from the risk of development ineffectiveness. And it was all dominated by fiduciary risk, reputational risk, all these types of different risks that were totally divorced, by the way, from the assumptions and risks in a theory of change and so on. So you kind of get the idea. So in many ways, that the culture, the management culture of the consulting firm mimicked that of the donor, which was quite cautious because political leadership don't like U-turns. They don't like making mistakes. So there's that as well. But I've always been a firm believer is, state the case clearly why you need an M&E team on top of, or an advisor on top of the management team, because that makes it quite contrived and difficult to integrate into a system and a team.
It's really interesting to hear that reflection from you, Daniel, in terms of the supplier, the service provider, almost taking on the culture that has been created by the donor, by the whether that's like in the UK side, what used to be called DFID, or USAID on the US side. If there is this sort of anxiety around what they're doing, the whole management and monitoring gets set up around risks. It gets set up around, so fiduciary risk or whatever. I completely get that. Having been in one of those institutions for, a period where there was a lot of attack from the Daily Mail, the Express, some of the right-wing press. It was sort of every day you were sort of, it did feel like you were in the bunker. Right.
Yeah.
So, and there were sort of the horror stories of the big aid failures, right? The ones that exploded in terms of the the damage done, in terms of reputation to the UK government and all the rest of it, and nobody wanted to be the person that sat on one of those programs that was seen as the big failure or the thing that were undermining the case for aid.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, with bilateral donors, when they're operating in such a sort of political context where there's such attack on what they're doing, do you think it's possible for them to have a very secure model of development which is not about the thousand things that are going to go wrong on fiduciary or reputation or whatever, but is based on actually that core thing that we're all wanting to achieve, those development results, and what's going to be the biggest barrier, that essential theory of change that should have been put in place from the very beginning?
I think you've got to look at, obviously, why those failures came about, why those crises came about, and so on. So, I mean, I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive. I'm not saying fiduciary risk isn't important, and it's the profile, and it's that, as you say, or what you're alluding to, it's that fear of uncertainty and fear of failure. And I think that is if you take about, the issue of the thoughtful monitoring, it doesn't reject the measurement of those results. It just rejects the false precision about them and the spurious accuracy sometimes. And I feel that there is a need for a more conservative approach to make sure that you're doing no harm, so to speak, but also at the same time you want to do good, and I think the former sometimes drives out the latter in terms of the culture of the place, and you all want results. It's just, I think sometimes people are so fixated on the results. So, for example, there was a really good example of what you're talking about. David Snowden did some work in the national health system in the UK under the kind of new management approach with Tony Blair and targets and so on. And one hospital, and my brother, who was a doctor, told me about this. One hospital met all the targets, was seen as announced as a top tier performer. 2 days later, there was an outcry about the abuse of patients at that same hospital and the harm that it did many people in terms of the psychiatric care, and the quality of the care had gone so poorly down that they'd ignored all that because they weren't being judged by those kinds of things. So sometimes it can have perverse incentives. So I think sometimes that happens in aid. We're so fixated with almost a fetish with indicators and obsessions about indicators. I work with USAID. They produce 3-page, what they call performance indicator reference sheets, 3 pages per indicator, explaining its definition, how it has become a fetish in development, and I think that's an issue. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's that balance, Richard, to strike that balance between giving management the confidence for the trial and error, but also the assurance that they are doing the right thing, and that has to come about through a culture of being as accountable to the people they serve and listening to them as well as the people who fund. So it's that striking of the balance.
Thank you, Daniel. And it rings true, right? Because I agree, absolutely agree with you. I think that there's a risk of hitting the target but missing the point. And I think there's a lot of things in international development where sometimes that rings true. And I remember one of the philosophies that I tried to have as an SRO, as somebody who had oversight of big aid programs, was, and this almost felt heretical in some circles, that I would rather crudely measure the right thing than accurately measure the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And it was a philosophy which I tried to keep going throughout the programs. But it was controversial because so many people say, well, hang on, that sounds like a really dodgy basis for getting that. Why don't you measure this? It's more, defendable or whatever. But it's that hitting the target and missing the point. and that's something which I think is in a way is a bigger risk than anything else. A lot of the time is hitting the target, but just like that hospital example you gave, actually missing the point of what it's all about.
Yeah, I think what thoughtful monitoring also does an emphasis is emphasize the assumptions. In other words, people talk a lot about how theories of change are better than log frames and all the rest of it. But still, despite, revealing the assumptions and making them explicit and so on and so forth, they're given very short shrift in monitoring. It's all about the indicators and the illusion of control that they give you. And in thoughtful monitoring places as much, if not more, emphasis on assumptions. What's happening to those assumptions? Because if you don't know what's happening to those assumptions, the indicator above them, the all-important outcome, for example, if you don't find out about the assumptions, you're too late. The value of the indicator will reveal itself, and whether it's good or not, depends. But I mean, the point is that you've got to keep eyes on the ball and to make sure that you are responsive and you are responding and adapting. And that doesn't come from the value of an indicator. It comes from what's happening to that assumption. Yet, as I said, they're given very short shrift.
Right. So in the absence of the hyper focus on quantitative metrics, how does a program manager successfully define and demonstrate accountability, especially to external funders who, like you gave with the USAID example and the various pages and pages of indicators, they still require measurable results?
As I said, it's not thoughtful monitoring doesn't reject the measurement. I'm not saying don't measure indicators. There are some caveats to that. You've got to be plausible. What you were saying. There are some indicators. I mean, let me give you an example. So on a typical agricultural program, the type of change, the results that you're after within the time frame of most projects should be about listening and learning to how farmers are responding to the messages, whatever the message is, whatever the support is. Are they rejecting it? Are they accepting it? Are they adapting it? All that intrigue, the interaction between the supply and the demand. But often that, for me, that is the key result about behavioral change and adaptation, both from the farmer, but also from how you're listening to his or her responses. But if you were to tell me that a plausible indicator would be an increase in yields as a consequence of that behavioral change, I just wouldn't believe it. It's just not, it's mathematically impossible to measure increases in yields within 5 years in rain-fed cropping systems. Simple, but still. So when we talk about results, you've got to think about things that are plausible, and the best way to for funders when they see that kind of integrity, it's an evidence of responsiveness rather than a rehearsed certainty of yields going up. And I think that in my experience with many philanthropics, not all, they often trust you more, not less, if you're that honest about things and changes and so forth. It won't tell you about increases in jobs and incomes and all of that, but it will tell you about how people are responding and if they're continuing to respond in certain ways and how that varies. All that intrigue about how farmers differ in their responses to one message or another message and so on. And if they're taking it and if they're accepting it and adapting it, then that surely is a critical result. It's like the PDF advisors in Nigerian federal ministries. If the civil servants give those advisors a legitimacy, and if they're being listened to, and if the civil servants are taking action on delivering reforms, and then that's just incredible as a result in and of itself. And we sometimes just don't give that as much importance. It's more a relational element, and that's the other crux of thoughtful monitoring. It is very relational. about the intersection between the people offering the support and the people who are supposed to, in theory, benefit from it. But you can't assess the benefits before you really understand how they realize those benefits by changing their behaviors, decisions, relationships. All of that is what I find so intriguing.
Thanks, Daniel. Thoughtful monitoring stresses learning from indigenous knowledge systems. What does learning from look like in practice, and how do M&E teams ensure they are genuinely learning and not simply extracting information?
I think that just an example, really. I did some work in Uganda many years ago up in the north, and there were kind of refugees, and we were talking to communities using just focus groups, and we were asking them about resilience, what it meant to them, and so on. And because of in the log frame or the theory of change, resilience was all about increases in the kind of independence or autarky of a household becoming more resilient. And the measures for that were things like, employment opportunities, increases in off-farm income, not just farm income, because of the risks and the access to the land. And it was telling. They described resilience in terms of relationships with each other and with the host community. And for me, it spoke of the value of the program in just another dialect of value, whereas in the official documents, that was kind of imposed as into one person's view of what resilience was. And I saw it again with USAID last year in their Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and how they coined it as individual resilience. Households become resilient, almost completely independent of anything else outside, and so on. So that's one example. Another example would be on, say, in agriculture, which I know, when it comes to climate change and the work at the moment, and this kind of twee phrasing called climate smart agriculture. And I'm a firm believer in learning from communities in agriculture about how polycropping, for example, and diversity, not volume of output, is key in terms of climate change and resilience. And how the programs I was working on in Malawi were shifting their advice based on indigenous systems, in terms of decisions they made on what to crop, what to mix up, and so forth. But nowadays, climate smart agriculture is almost an external imposition. It's like, this kind of, we know better than you, and this is the way to do it. And you've got programs, on that kind of line. And I think I learned a lot from a biodiversity person who worked in Zimbabwe in the mid 80s, called Ken Wilson. He used to work with the Christensen Foundation, and it was always important for him and for the communities to learn about coping strategies, or whatever the term is. So it's for me, it's about listening as a form of participation, not listening to confirm, but being prepared to alter based on what we hear. And I think that's a really important element of indigenous systems and the interaction. So it becomes a form of exchange, not extraction of information from communities. It's learning about what they do and then responding to how to improve that, rather than coming with something completely new. So it's almost like an act of humility. You go in, and you listen. And I think that's a key thing. And I think in practice it means sitting with people and asking what is changing, and what do you see as progress, and allowing them in their terms to define almost what the purpose and objectives of the program are, and where they want to go to. And that, whether that's a minister, or whether that's a farmer in a community, or health workers in a community outreach center, the principle still holds. And the other thing is, we forget also, is is how communities make decisions. There's a lot of work going on in indigenous evaluation about how communities make decisions with what type of information and so on. So you need to understand those systems as well and help to support them, and it becomes an exchange. Because if you don't know how communities and individuals make decisions, then the monitoring of the program becomes pretty obsolete in terms of that key objective of being holding yourselves to account to the people that you're supporting and working with.
There's a lot of food for thought in what you just said, Daniel, and climate smart agriculture is an area you and I have had discussions on in the past. I was also thinking about land titling as well. There's a nice podcast episode that Favor and I recorded with Andrew Smith when he was talking about land titling work they were doing in northern Nigeria. And some of those indigenous systems and those indigenous property and indigenous perspectives on land ownership and community and things that absolutely interplayed with the work, and you ignored that at your peril, basically, in terms of the effectiveness. But then also, thinking about the climate smart agriculture, regenerative agriculture, whatever it is, for me, that is one of my biggest regrets, I guess, for my career on the international development side as the donor side, which was trying to keep promoting a very Western-centric model of agriculture based around chemical inputs. Now, that's not necessarily the fault of donors. That's the way the world went, right? Big US-style farming, lots of chemical inputs, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. That was the way global farming went. And so we shouldn't just blame the donors in terms of they were reflecting the way the world became, as opposed to... But if you look at now what's happening with climate smart agriculture, exactly as you say, a lot of this is a return to indigenous techniques, like traditional techniques that people did before Western agricultural approaches were put back on them. Yes, there are some nuances, there's some subtleties, there are some differences, but a lot of what you can find in regenerative agriculture around diversity, around soil health, around all these different aspects of boosting productivity, they go back to indigenous systems as well. And therefore, there's a degree of humility, I think, required from the intervention side of saying, well, we can say, oh, no, this is old-fashioned style farming. We've got to do, we've got to increase productivity tenfold, and you do this by greater fertilizer provision, chemical fertilizer provision. Or the alternative approach is that you try and understand what's worked in the past, what's worked in the environment, and you build something more sustainable and something that can go the distance, because Western agriculture is not sustainable. It's not something which can go the distance. I'll let you come in, Daniel, because I can see your.
No, I'm agreeing. I'm a great believer. I wrote a piece with this guy Ken Wilson. He helped me write it about on the African continent. I'm not saying look at pre-colonial Africa through rose-tinted spectacles or anything like that. There were really good things, also not so good things. But on agriculture, both from the production side and the trading side, those systems were completely broken down by colonialism. And I think there are some, not all answers, but some answers lie in Africa reconnecting with her history, pre-colonial history, on things like food systems, trading patterns, and a lot of issues to do with food security. A lot of those aspects, I think, she should reconnect with. Amilcar Cabral, the liberation leader in Guinea-Bissau, made similar points. He was an agronomist, and he learned so much about the culture of agriculture, not just a kind of an industrial system, but a human system. And I think the human ecology of that often gets left out. And I think that's what's happened in the West. And I think it's a lesson to be learned. And I think there's a lot of rich history there that I think, and culture and practice, that developing agriculture now should reconnect with.
To you and King, I know you both are championing an integrated approach between value for investment and thoughtful monitoring. Essentially, how can we move from measurement to meaning? So, how does the core questions of both sides, for instance, value for investment is asking what constitutes good value, and thoughtful monitoring is asking who is this for and why do they care? So how does these core questions of both sides, how can they unite to create a better, more robust evaluation framework?
Julian distinguishes value for money, almost sees money as a cost, not a good thing. It's almost you giving something up. So he replaced investment or money with investment, because it is an investment that has a return rather than just the money spent and hopefully something will pop out the other end kind of thing. So that was his that's why he put emphasis on it's an investment. It isn't just a cost, so to speak. So that's how he explained the difference and the significance for him of that difference. I guess when Julie and I we only met, we met a couple of times. When we first met earlier on this year, we had a kind of shared critic kind of value that it was the pursuit of the meaning of the monitoring and the evaluation, not just the measurement of it. What constitutes good value, and for whom? Again, we get back to this issue of listening and listening to the people, what value they want out of the exchange. So it's a minister, a farmer, a community-based clinic, entities like that. That's what we're really asking, and what value they want out of it. And I think, and also for the team as well, it's like the PDF advisors. I remember asking them, what value do you get out of this work? Those things matter too. So it's basically humanizing everything and making sure that humanity doesn't get lost in the messaging, from both sides, the people, and also the donor or the funder has put down in writing what value they think they're going to get out of it. But sometimes that's wanting other people to benefit. That's how they value it. But how do they themselves value it? What's it do, and so on. So that was where the value for investment came in, and the thoughtful monitoring is more about, well, who's this for and why do they care? I mean, it's just very simple kind of questions. So that's why Julie and I thought that the two combined would be a very useful. Value for investment gives you that evaluative rigor, the what they call evaluative thinking and critical thinking and inquisitiveness and so forth. And then thoughtful monitoring gives you the kind of moral compass of all of that, in terms of ensuring that good is defined with, not for people. So it's not just, we think this is good for you, therefore that's going to be the top of our log frame, and so on and so forth. So it shifts the whole emphasis of monitoring from measurement to kind of something more meaningful for different people, in terms of why beneficiaries engage, or why clients engage, why ministers engage, why farmers engage, but also the frontline staff. So it gives them meaning to their work, and also their interaction with the people they're supporting. So I think that the combination was from a realization originally that these things were treated as separate entities. So you have your M&E expert, and then you have your value for money expert, and then you have your value for money framework, in addition to a log frame, in addition to it all got just olympically bureaucratic and quite contrived, where you had a poor manager sitting amongst the value for money specialists with their own little framework and indicators, and then you had an M&E specialist, and then you had an evaluation coming along, and the whole thing just got completely out of hand. So we thought, no, let's stop this and let's try and say they are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, Daniel, I mean, Favor and I have worked on quite a few value for money frameworks now for programs. And what we tend to find is that the better the log frame is, the more the log frame is really articulating the value of the program, the more likely you are that your VFM indicators just drop out from that. They're almost like the logical next step from a very good results framework that's drafted. And where you have more challenges is if either there's not a very strong results framework which is in place, it doesn't necessarily reflect the value that the program is driving, or if you end up coming up with a completely different value for money framework which is at odds with what the results frame. I mean, that just doesn't make sense, right? Something's gone wrong
Yeah.
if that's happening.
No, that's true, and I think there was a really good commentary by the National Audit Office on DFID back in the day, saying that they stripped, I don't know if you remember, they stripped out activities and process from a log frame. And that actually hampered anyone's attempt to assess the value for money. I think the phrase was, if you don't know how much money you're spending, how can you assess the value of it? Kind of thing, or what you're spending on. So one of the more mundane aspects of thoughtful monitoring is to try and link the financial with the non-financial using, it isn't a participatory funky method, it's called activity-based costing. So that you actually cost out what the outputs are, including the overheads, not just the direct costs, but the indirect, the overheads, if you like, and trying to portion those out. And that does help. But yeah, I think that, if you have a good log frame theory of change that breaks down the work structure of a program, then you can correlate spend, financial and non-financial much more easily.
It always surprises me, Daniel, just how many programs, even to today, can't, when you ask them how much did you spend on this particular activity which got this star result for the program overall, they can't tell you. They can break down spend in many different ways. They can tell you what they spent on overheads, what they spent on various other headings that they might have, but to actually be able to tell you the story of spend as it relates to activities, as it relates to then the results that happen, still seems to be a challenge. And I don't think it's, I think there's something of a disconnect. And I think this maybe goes back to the development partner fault, the donor fault in a way, is that we're asking for things from suppliers in silos. So you've got the finance and accounts team who are asking for financial accounting information, and they're asking for it in a way that makes sense to them as accountants. And then you've got the results people asking for information as results specialists in a way that makes sense. And you never get that join up, because I don't believe suppliers do not have the capability to set up systems which would be able to give you instantly what you spent on an activity and link that to a result. I think they're setting up systems based on what's asked of them by the development partners, the donors, but that's not delivering the kind of management information you need to effectively manage a program and to ensure value for investment, value for money, however you want to term it.
I think the funders, I'm not saying donors, but just people who fund, it just seems to be part of the culture to separate out financial from technical. So one of the things I always fought against with this consulting company I work with, they saw me as a technical person, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, because they had one view of it. But the deliberate divorcing of financial from non-financial means that, you do have a budget system that's set up by types of things you spend money on, staff, whatever it is, the typical budget breakdown. And that sits really uncomfortably or disconnected completely from what the money's spent on in terms of outputs and activities. And that means that how can you adapt? On what basis are you doing less of something or more of something else without knowing how much you spent? It just doesn't make any sense either way you look at it. And I did some work with a charity recently on a pro bono and asked to do an evaluation based on data from lots of different people. And at the end of the meeting, I said, by the way, how much does all this cost? So they didn't really know. It took them quite a bit of time to know. But the other thing, of course, it does is that they know how much they've spent, but they don't know how much anything costs. So that's a big problem. It's really mundane. It really on a curiosity level, but it kind of forced me to go on an activity-based costing course about 20 years ago. So,
Well, I mean, this is what I feel that there's hope as development practitioners. I feel like we engage with the world not as we wish it to be, but as it is. And I think there are practical techniques you can, even with this disconnect in the systems, which is very frustrating in terms of that integrated management of a program and thoughtful management, thoughtful monitoring that you might be trying to push forward. But it doesn't take too long. If you sit down with the right intervention leads, if we're not going for accounting level accuracy, if we're going for ballpark figures, you can sit down with an output lead or an intervention lead or whatever, and you can go through, right, well, okay, we don't have this info, but how much roughly over the past 6 months, what percentage of your time was spent working on this activity? And they can tell you 20%, 25%, 40%. You can apportion it that way. And that's usually good enough, right? Because if you look at the benefits and the results, they're usually massive for successful interventions. The results can be huge, and so it doesn't make a difference if you're out by £11.50 or £100 or even £1,000 sometimes on the cost side. But having something is a start.
Yeah, no, definitely, it is doable. I was a team leader in Lesotho for 4 years, testing that if I'm a good M&E person, I can be a good team leader, and I was in many ways, and I wasn't in others, but. One of the ways it was really worked for me was doing exactly what you said. We had about an 8 million quid program, DFID funded, and we had 2 components: food security, job creation. And I asked each team leader to break down their outputs by activities and to cost those activities, so like bottom up financing type thing. And it was really, really helpful to know what the money was being spent on. I was an overhead, and I knew roughly how much of my time was spent on each component and what activity and so on. It's not difficult to do, but the problem is it's not asked for. But no, it's very simple and can be really powerful in terms of knowing where the money's going. So
if we go back then to the integration of value for investment and thoughtful monitoring, it sort of aims for mutual accountability, doesn't it? So what does mutual accountability look like on the ground between, say, a community, a frontline worker, and a funder? What does that look like?
Well, it kind of sounds quite lofty, doesn't it? But actually, it's really practical. Picture a small meeting, with a couple of community members and a frontline staff, perhaps someone from the funding agency as well, all looking at the same evidence in terms of what's changing, what's not changing, what's being provided, how people are responding to what's being provided, how that differs, whether it's been accepting. It's no blame, no theatre, just making sense of stuff, in terms of what's being provided, how well it's being provided. And the mutual accountability issue kicks in where the community are having candid conversations with the frontline staff about the quality of the support, the relevance of the support, and the people providing the support at the same time are understanding how people are responding to it. Not just it, but how well it has been delivered and how and so on. So the community through that sees that their insights matter, that they are being given an opportunity to see how they are represented. And the frontline worker, and this is the anecdote circle thing in Nigeria, that they feel that it's safe to be honest. One of them was was just from New York. This guy was from New York. He just was completely at sea. He had no idea. He said the electricity doesn't work, the lift doesn't work. This guy came from New York with some big city. He was really, so all the other he's Nigerian as well, but diaspora, all the other Nigerians who knew the lay of the land a lot better almost took him under their wing and took him out for lunch and all that, that support. And through that, he felt the fact that he said what he said was brilliant, because he had the confidence to say how he felt in front of his peers. He probably would never have said that to other people. So it's about the honesty, I think, is the key thing about mutual accountability. It's being accountable to the donors, of course, you need to be. But I think for the donors to see a program behaving like that should give them more confidence in the likely success of the program. And honesty is not an act of defiance like that. It's almost an act of like civilization. We're civil, how we carry out, how we conduct ourselves, how we carry. It's the difference between surveillance and solidarity, basically. So it's the solidarity of those three people sitting down, or two of them anyway. And solidarity, again, in Nigeria with the embedded advisors. They felt that there was solidarity between them, in terms of what they're trying to do and so on. So everyone leaves the room informed and fairly answerable. So that mutual accountability, it sounds lofty as an ideal. It's in declarations and so forth. But if you don't have mutual accountability, where do you learn? If you don't hold yourself account to the people you're supporting, how the hell do you learn anything?
So this is a bit of an aside, Daniel, but the number of individuals from that cohort of embedded advisors that have just gone on to do brilliant things they were doing brilliant things at the time, but now they're just doing transformational things. There's so many of them have gone on to do really transformational bits of work on the back of it. And, these are things that, often these are really foundational periods for these individuals, right? Where they gain that confidence, they start seeing, they start operating at a very substantial scale, and it opens the door to them to making a lot more impact in the future. Sadly, our monitoring systems don't pick up on that kind of thing, right? You kind of close at the end of the program, but you don't see the ripple effects from some of these experiences.
Yeah, and also the ripple effects in the ministries that they've left. What happens, what's happened after the fact, and what old-fashioned way you call ex-post impact evaluations. What actually happens afterwards with them as individuals, but also within the ministries. And that's what I meant about these things. Take a huge amount of time to fully capture the impact of stuff. You need to go back and have a peek later on. You can't just wrap it up after 5 years and come up with a successor program without knowing actually what can we learn 3 years after PDF about informing us anything as a successor.
Let me indulge with one more reflection, and I said this to somebody else this week. There are a surprising number of donor-initiated interventions that were which were started in the 90s and yet are quietly still going on, which are owned by government. And I'll give you a great example. If you go down to Enugu in the southeast in Nigeria, there is I believe it's an SME support center, which was initially set up, I think, probably 20 years ago by the World Bank and DFID. It's completely owned by the Enugu state government now, and where they're just providing support to small and medium enterprises, or MSMEs, in Enugu, helping them tap into funds for finance and all the rest of it. Now, there was probably a 5-year results framework for that program, and at the end of the 5 years, it stopped being monitoring, and yet it's gone for more than 20 years. Yeah. And it's still having an impact today, even after the donor funding has dried up. We've had examples of advisors that have gone into the Kaduna Revenue Authority, and even after the program finished and the payment for their time stopped, the advisors remained on the board and continued to help shape the approach of that institution long after the donors. Nobody's counting that kind of stuff. Nobody's looking at that stuff, but it's still happening. And there's a lot of ignorance is too strong a word, but there's a lot of let's say underappreciating the lasting legacy that some really positive donor interventions can make. And it's a shame that those stories aren't told more often.
Yeah. No, I think it's a huge, so many lessons you can learn from, the fact that it's still going on is brilliant. So the whole sustainability, dare I say, systemic change or whatever, but also, with, okay, so what do we do now? And if you don't know what's been going on long after the fact, then that's a bit of a missed opportunity in terms of future programming. Definitely. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. I think this has been a lovely conversation so far. So, in your article with Julian, you both conclude that the integration of value for investment and thoughtful monitoring is about culture change, right? And so, what is, in your view, what is the biggest internal cultural barrier that organizations face when trying to move forward towards a truly integrated, thoughtful M&E system?
Oh God, I think one of the key cultural things is that not knowing is a form of failure, or the fear of not knowing something. I think that I think that's aggravated by the emphasis on results. But I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying that because you're paid on results or whatever, you don't have the luxury of actually admitting to yourself that you don't actually know what's going to happen and so on. So I think it's that fear of failure or fear of not knowing and so on. It's like the whole payment by results thing as well, kind of reinforce that to a certain extent. And you end up counting things without much comprehension of actually what's going on. You can't afford to know what's going on. You just need to know that you're delivering stuff and change is happening and enforcing yourself. And the scandal isn't ignorance. It's more the pretense of omniscience, of kind of knowing things. And I think that's for me, that's the culture. That's the culture of how the whole thing has been set up. Some of it from a consulting company is the profit issue as well. That's certainly. I'm not a huge fan. Although I work for consulting companies, I'm not a huge fan about the amount of money these guys make. But they make them because they just deliver stuff and with mixed results. But so I think the real courage lies in saying we don't know yet, but we're learning, especially early on. I think that's an issue. I think that in the early days of a program, if you think about it, you're just beginning to understand and learn and put things out there through the outputs, and you don't know how people are responding, but you're learning, and I think that's the confidence to say that we don't know, but we're learning about how folk are responding to different things and how that differs according to this output or that output, with these financial implications, and therefore this, and how that differentiates also amongst the different people, the federal ministries in Nigeria or districts on that agriculture, WASH health program and so on. So I think that's the real barrier, that culture.
What would be your advice to program teams or leaders considering this integrated approach of value for investment and thoughtful monitoring?
Couple of things. Don't start the process by developing a theory of change or a log frame would be my one piece of advice.
Hold on, don't start the process.
Don't start the process. So whenever you see a guidebook on M&E or M or E or whatever variation, it always says the first step, develop a log frame or a theory of change. And then everything, you can join the dots from there on in. Then you have a framework, then you have indicators, then you have performance indicator reference sheets and da-di-da-di-da, and it becomes a really mundane, fairly boring exercise, quite mechanistic. Start the process by saying, why do we need an M&E system? How does it relate to our financial system? How does it relate to our delivery system? Who needs to run it? Do we need someone to come in to help us? Who needs answers to what questions and when and why? And those more mental tools that looks at a system in a holistic sense. Once you start a process by developing a theory of change, we've all been there, it develops a life of its own. Its audience doesn't wax, it wanes, starts off in a workshop, and then it's the unfortunate M&E person who's given all the responsibilities to do all of it. And you can say until you're blue in the face, it's monitoring is part and parcel of the team's approach. Yeah. So that would be my one piece of advice. The second piece of advice is start small, but be very sincere about what you're trying to do. Don't launch a big thing, a reform, but begin with an honest reflection session where people can say what they feel without fear. In other words, the conversation is my first piece of advice. Have that conversation. Start small. Don't develop some big thing like a theory of change. Just start small. And anchor your learning in useful questions. As I said, why do we need this? What do we need? And so on. Who is the information for? What are their decision uncertainties at the beginning, in the middle, in the end, or certainly at the beginning? What do we need to know first? What's the really critical thing? And if you do all this, I believe, so the kind of evidence that comes out of those conversations, those kind of more mental tools, as I said, it becomes a relationship between different people. And how it embeds itself, and people have a stake, as opposed to developing a theory of change with your theory of change expert who comes with all their theory of change love, and people get disconnected from it. It's too abstract. If we can do that, then monitoring will stop becoming an awkward cousin, and people will engage with it and see it as part of their job because they have a stake right at the beginning. They don't have to be taught any theory and then get up to speed. And then it can start becoming a wise companion, to everyone. The management, the people who are being supported, and the funders as well. And lastly, read around a little bit. I've kind of learned so much from outside the development space. I've quoted a few people, and I've learned so much, whether it's reading critical thinkers like Christopher Hitchens, or whether it's reading Deming from the 1950s and 60s on management and quality management and so on. In M&E work, it's dominated very much by academics for some reason, because it's obviously closely intertwined with research. But you can get some really good practitioners as well in development and outside. So yeah, read around a little bit. That's really helped me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Daniel. If anyone following our podcast wants to engage you or connect with you and get some of your wisdom on their projects or interventions, what's the best way to connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn and email.
Excellent. So Daniel Ticehurst on LinkedIn, and they can find, if they're watching you on the YouTube channel, they can see a nice picture of you and make sure they get the right individual.
This has been I think it's the kind of conversation you only get after many years of experience. I've learned a lot as a newbie and hopeful to start off with your knowledge. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
It was
No
truly a
problem.
masterclass.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So Favour, what did you make of all of that?
So I think I had said in the beginning about how this was a lesson learning for us as value for money consultant, because we sit with the M&E part of development, and then we begin to ask questions. Okay, how can you ensure that your program is as effective as it needs to be? But Daniel is challenging us to say we need to move beyond just measuring, beyond just indicators, but rather like let's move towards meaning. And what meaning looks like is the questions that we're asking, how is it being beneficial to the people that we are there to serve, right? And that means that we need to really reflect and think about how does our monitoring and evaluation systems, how do they help us learn, and how do they help us adapt. I like the fact that he talked about that in development work, that a lot it seems like we are allergic to error. And a part of me is like, okay, that makes sense. We're dealing with the lives of people, so of course we want to get it right. Like we want to be sure that, oh, the work that we are doing is hard to say. You're spending billions of dollars or whatever, and then you're not seeing the changes that you need to be. So I do understand, the part of me understands the part of, oh, like we are allergic to error. But we also need to be humble enough, as he said, to allow for trial and error. That is within that trial and error that we can actually begin to now better understand. We're asking questions like, what is changing? What are the beneficiaries adapting to? What are they actually accepting? Not just be strict and say, oh, let's measure how many yields, how many farmers attended so training. And not like we will not measure those indicators, but what are they actually telling us? And so for me, that was like a big learning. And then I think the point that he made was that thoughtful monitoring is not against measuring indicators, but it is against the false precision of those indicators, in the sense that we need that humility within development space to say, I don't know, as he says, because it's very hard to say, oh, I don't know what is changing yet. But if we can embrace that humility, we can actually begin to see those changes that we need to see. And maybe finally was the fact that he said thoughtful monitoring places emphasis on assumptions. Let us assume. We are saying assumptions more than, oh, this is what it is and we are 100% sure, because you're talking about human beings. You're talking about factors that continuously change. And so it's okay to say we are still on this learning journey. I thoroughly enjoyed Daniel's insights. How about you, Richard? What were some of your takeaways?
I thought they're really insightful comments, Favour. I'll just add two things, really. The old management adage that what you measure is what you get. And it's why what we measure is so important. And it shows the risk of when you go and measure something which you can measure precisely, often you go down the wrong path, just as we were discussing with Daniel. And as I said in the episode with Daniel, I'd rather crudely measure the right thing than accurately measure the wrong thing. And I think being comfortable with that as development practitioners, to make sure that we are doing the learning, we are focusing on what's going to really make a difference for the people that the program is set up to deliver meaningful change for, is absolutely the right path to go down. And it's one of the philosophies that we as Flywheel Economics hold very dear to us as we do our work. So no, this has been a great episode. I hope it's been useful to our audience. And if they do wish to learn more about the work that Flywheel Economics do in this space, more information can be found on our website under the Aid, Effectiveness and Value for Money part of our website.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, this was truly an insightful episode, and I would like to just say thank you once again to Daniel for coming on the show, sharing a bit about thoughtful monitoring and value for investment with us. Just as a reminder that this episode is actually the third in our Value for Money and Aid Effectiveness mini series. So if you have missed out on any of the previous episodes, just go to our channel or wherever you stream podcasts and you'll find the remaining 2 episodes there. Just to let you know as well that we're really interested in you coming alongside this journey with us, because the work that we do here is important and highly relevant. So kindly subscribe to the Flywheel Economics podcast wherever you stream your episode. And we are also very interested in hearing your thoughts and your feedback. So head over to our social media. We are on all platforms. Our handle across board is Flywheel Economics. And as Richard said, you can head over to our website as well for for more information to see the fascinating topics that we cover here. Until next time, this has been the Flywheel Economics Podcast.